The fluorescent lights hum their endless song above me, a mechanical drone that never stops, never falters, never gives you mercy. I have been employed at Blackstone Correctional Facility for 3 years, and I have learned that this sound is the heartbeat of this place. This place exists somewhere in the forgotten corners of Nevada, where the desert stretches endlessly, and the town closest to us is barely more than a cluster of abandoned buildings. Nobody asks many questions about Blackstone. Nobody wants to know what happens inside these walls. My name is Robert, and I am 34 years old. I work as a guard, Tier 1 certification, which means I supervise the inmates in the general population during most hours of the day. I have seen things in this prison that would make most people lose their minds. I have witnessed acts of kindness between men who have nothing left to lose. I have watched violence erupt from the smallest insult. I have learned that this place runs on rules that make no logical sense to the outside world. But inside these walls, they are everything. 3 years I have worked here, and I still cannot fully comprehend why some of the rules exist. Take, for instance, the rule about the color blue. No inmate is permitted to wear anything blue in the East Wing. Not blue shirts, not blue patches, not even blue thread on their uniforms. When I first heard this rule during my training, I asked my supervisor, a man named Mike who has worked here for 17 years, why this was the case. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and told me that some rules do not need reasons. Some rules just exist because they have always existed. The official explanation given to us during orientation was vague and unsatisfying. Apparently, during an incident in the early 1990s, something happened in the East Wing involving blue fabric. The details were never clarified. No one speaks about it directly. The rule simply became law within this facility, and no one questioned it further. I learned quickly that questioning the rules at Blackstone was a good way to become invisible. Guards who asked too many questions were reassigned to desk duty or the laundry facility, which everyone knew was a form of punishment disguised as a lateral move. Another rule that struck me as particularly strange was the no eye contact rule during lunch hours. From 12 p.m. to 1 p.m., inmates were not permitted to make direct eye contact with anyone, not with other inmates, not with guards, not with anyone. The punishment for breaking this rule was solitary confinement for 5 days. I asked Mike about this one as well, and he told me that years ago, a riot had been prevented by a staring contest. I still do not understand what that means. Mike refused to elaborate, and I learned not to press him. The first time I witnessed someone being taken to solitary for making eye contact during lunch hour, it was an inmate named James. He was a smaller man, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and a gentle demeanor. He had accidentally looked up from his food tray and made contact with another inmate across from him. The other inmate had alerted a guard, and James was removed immediately. I watched him be escorted away, and I saw in his eyes a resignation that only comes from years of understanding that the rules of this place are absolute. Every morning, I wake up at 4:30 a.m. I have to arrive at Blackstone by 6 a.m. for my shift, which runs until 2 p.m. The facility is only 35 miles from my apartment, but the drive takes almost an hour because there is only one main road in and out, and it winds through terrain that seems deliberately designed to confuse and disorient visitors. I have never seen another car on that road. Sometimes I wonder if other guards live elsewhere, if they somehow teleport into this place rather than driving through that endless landscape. When I arrive at the facility gate at 5:55 a.m., I am always greeted by the same security check. I have to present my identification badge, empty my pockets, submit to a metal detector, and answer a series of questions. The questions change slightly each day, which I assume is designed to prevent us from becoming complacent. One morning, a guard asked me if I had any intention of harming the inmates. I said no. Another morning, a different guard asked me what my favorite color was. I said green. I have learned not to question these things. The changing room is always cold, even in summer. I hang my street clothes in my locker and put on my uniform, which consists of a tan shirt, brown pants, and a brown jacket. The uniform is mandatory, and there are very specific rules about how it must be worn. Your shirt must be tucked in at all times. Your jacket must be buttoned completely or completely unbuttoned, never partially buttoned. Your belt must be worn at the exact middle of your waist. These are not merely suggestions. These are rules. Mike first explained this to me on my first day. He said that the inmates understand order through consistency. If a guard looks sloppy, the inmates lose respect for authority. This is the official reason given. However, I have come to understand that the real reason is far more abstract. The rules about appearance are not actually about appearance at all. They are about control. They are about maintaining the understanding that everyone here, both guards and inmates, are part of a larger machine. We are all cogs, and cogs must function predictably. It was during my second week at Blackstone that I first noticed something genuinely unsettling about the prison itself. I was assigned to supervise the recreation yard, which is an open area where inmates are permitted to exercise, walk, or simply sit in the sun for 2 hours during the middle of the day. The yard is surrounded by a 20-foot wall topped with razor wire. There are guard towers at each corner with officers who carry rifles. It is as secure as any space in the world could be. On that particular day, the temperature was around 95 degrees. It was late June and the desert heat was relentless. I stood near the gate, watching the inmates move through the yard. Most of them were engaged in some form of activity. Some played basketball on a faded court. Others simply walked in circles. And then I noticed something that made my skin prickle with an inexplicable dread. Every single inmate who was walking in circles was moving in the same direction, clockwise. Every single one. I watched for 45 minutes and not one person deviated from this pattern. They all moved clockwise around the perimeter of the yard. When I mentioned this observation to Tyler, a senior guard who had been at Blackstone for nearly 12 years, he looked at me with an expression that suggested I had just asked him to explain the nature of reality itself. "They have always done it," Tyler said simply. "It is not a written rule, Robert. It is just something they do. But why?" I asked. "I do not know," Tyler replied. "Maybe it has to do with the sun. Maybe they believe the sun moves in a certain direction and they follow it. Maybe it is something else entirely. The important thing is that they do it consistently, and as long as they keep doing it, there is no trouble." I pressed further, asking if there had ever been an incident where an inmate walked counterclockwise and Tyler became visibly uncomfortable. He told me that such a thing had happened once, years ago, and that it had resulted in a lockdown. He did not provide any other details, and I learned once again that asking questions here was not encouraged. I began to develop a friendship of sorts with Tyler during those early months. Unlike Mike, who seemed to view his job as something to endure with resigned acceptance, Tyler actually seemed to enjoy working at Blackstone. He took pride in understanding the rhythms and patterns of the place. He knew every inmate's name, their history, their tendencies, and their triggers. He could walk through a hallway and sense tension before anything violent occurred. This ability was uncanny, almost supernatural in nature. One day in October, during a routine supply inventory, Tyler shared something with me that I have never forgotten. We were in the storage room, checking boxes of food and linens that had been delivered that morning. The room was quiet except for the sound of boxes being moved and lists being checked. Tyler suddenly stopped working and looked directly at me. "Have you started noticing the patterns yet?" he asked. "What patterns?" I responded, though I already knew exactly what he meant. "The way this place breathes," Tyler said. "It is not just a building, Robert. This place is alive. It has moods. It has rhythms. And if you learn to read those rhythms, you can survive here for a very long time. But if you fight against them, if you try to impose logic or reason on them, then you will slowly go insane." I asked Tyler if he believed there was something supernatural about Blackstone, and he laughed a hollow laugh that echoed in the storage room. "Supernatural?" he repeated. "That might be easier to deal with. Supernatural things are not bound by the rules of physics. This place is bound by something else entirely, something that makes sense on its own level but makes no sense to us." That conversation disturbed me in a way I could not quite articulate. Tyler was not an unreasonable man. He was intelligent, composed, and practical. He was not the type to believe in ghost stories or unexplained phenomena. Yet he spoke about Blackstone with the kind of certainty that only comes from personal experience and extended observation. Mealtimes at Blackstone operate under rules that seem designed specifically to prevent any form of normalcy. There are 4 mealtimes each day. Breakfast is served at 6:30 a.m., lunch is served at 12 p.m., dinner is served at 5 p.m., and there is a final meal, which we call supper, served at 9 p.m. Each meal is served in a cafeteria that is divided into 12 sections. Each inmate is assigned to a specific section based on a system that we were never fully explained. The rule about sections is straightforward. An inmate must always sit in their assigned section. They cannot sit in a different section, even if their assigned section is full and other sections are empty. If an inmate sits in the wrong section, they are immediately removed from the cafeteria and sentenced to eating in their cell for the next 3 meal times. This rule seems unnecessarily restrictive, but it is enforced without exception. What makes this rule even stranger is that the sections themselves appear to serve no logical purpose. They are simply marked areas on the floor, 12 equal zones that divide the large cafeteria space. There is no visible reason why one section would be preferable to another. Yet the inmates seem to understand some hierarchy or system related to these sections, and they respect it absolutely. I witnessed a confrontation between 2 inmates during my 3rd month at Blackstone. One inmate, a large man named Nick who had been here for 12 years, was attempting to move to a different section. His friend had recently been moved to Section 7, and Nick wanted to sit with him. The cafeteria monitor stopped him immediately. Nick was not aggressive about it. He simply accepted the decision and returned to his assigned section. He did not speak to his friend again for 3 months, until he was transferred to work in the laundry facility and presumably given different meal assignments. One of the strangest aspects of working at Blackstone is the inconsistent temperature throughout the facility. The building is massive, a sprawling complex that was built in phases over several decades. Some sections are kept at a comfortable temperature year-round. Other sections are inexplicably cold, even during summer months. And still other sections are oppressively hot, regardless of the season. I asked a maintenance worker named Michael about this one day. Michael was a civilian employee, not a guard, which meant he was less guarded in his speech. He told me that the heating and cooling systems in the facility were deliberately designed to operate independently in different sections. The official reason given was energy efficiency, but Michael did not believe that was the true purpose. They used the temperature as a tool, Michael explained to me while we stood in the hallway outside the maintenance office. Certain inmates are moved to hot sections or cold sections depending on what behavior they are displaying. It is a form of conditioning, though I am not sure anyone actually sits down and plans it out that way. It just sort of happens. The inmates learn to associate certain behaviors with certain environmental consequences. I asked Michael if the guards were aware of this, and he looked at me with a mixture of pity and concern. The guards who have been here long enough understand that this place runs on its own logic, he said. The rest eventually figure it out or they get reassigned. This conversation made me extremely uncomfortable because I realized that I was beginning to notice the pattern Michael described. Inmates who were becoming aggressive would eventually be moved to work in hotter sections of the facility. Inmates who were becoming withdrawn would be moved to colder sections. It seemed to have a corrective effect, pulling them back towards some imaginary center point where behavioral compliance was optimal. Blackstone goes into lockdown for reasons that are sometimes clear and sometimes entirely mysterious. When there is a fight or an escape attempt, the lockdown is announced and everyone understands the reason. But there have been numerous lockdowns during my 3 years here that were never explained to us. The alarms would sound, we would lock down all sections, conduct prisoner counts, and then after anywhere from 4 to 8 hours, we would be told to resume normal operations. No explanation would be given. The inmates seem to expect these unexplained lockdowns. They do not react with concern or curiosity. They simply return to their cells, and when the lockdown ends, they resume their routines as if nothing happened. This acceptance, this lack of surprise or question, is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of it all. During the 5th lockdown of my tenure, which lasted approximately 6 hours and was never explained, I was stationed in Block C, which houses the general population. I walked the corridors while the inmates were in their cells. The silence was absolute and unnatural. Usually there is some background noise, voices, footsteps, the sounds of the facility operating, but during lockdowns there is nothing but silence. As I walked past one cell, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. An inmate was humming a melody, not a song that I recognized, but something that sounded distinctly mathematical in its precision. The melody repeated exactly every 16 seconds. The inmate did not vary it. He did not speed it up or slow it down. Every cycle of the melody took exactly 16 seconds. I stood there listening for 3 minutes, and in those 3 minutes, I heard the melody repeat 11 times, each repetition identical to the previous one. I did not see the inmate's face. I only heard the sound, but it filled me with a sense of profound unease that I could not shake for the rest of that day. Despite the increasingly strange nature of this place, I found myself developing a genuine friendship with Tyler. We began eating lunch together in the employee break room. Tyler told me stories about his life before Blackstone, about his family, about his dreams and aspirations. He was a different person outside the prison, or at least he seemed to be. Inside, he was focused and alert. Outside, even in the employee areas, he was more relaxed and more human. Tyler had been working at Blackstone for 12 years, which made him one of the longest-serving guards in the facility. He told me that he had applied for transfer requests on 3 separate occasions, but each request had been denied. The reasons given were administrative, something about his skill set being too valuable to the facility's operations, but Tyler believed the real reason was something darker. Once you have been here long enough to really understand how this place operates, they will not let you leave, Tyler told me one day. It is not that they prevent you from leaving in an official capacity. It is that they make you understand something about yourself and about the world that makes it impossible to leave. You become aware of a level of reality that most people never see, and you cannot just go back to pretending it does not exist. I asked Tyler what specific level of reality he was referring to, but he would not elaborate. He simply told me that if I stayed long enough, I would understand what he meant. He was not threatening me. He was simply stating a fact. The way someone might tell you that if you stay in the sun long enough, you will get sunburned. It was during my 8th month at Blackstone that I learned there was an inmate who shared my name. His name was Robert, and he had been incarcerated at Blackstone for 19 years. He was serving a life sentence for a crime that was now considered a relic of an older era. Most of the inmates and guards knew him simply as Robert the Lifer, to distinguish him from Robert the Guard, which was me. When I first learned this, I felt an inexplicable sense of connection to this man I had never met. There was something almost mystical about sharing a name with someone in a place like this. I made a point of learning which cell block he was housed in, and I requested assignment to that block as frequently as possible. The first time I saw Robert the Lifer, I was genuinely surprised. He was an older man, probably in his early 60s, with white hair and a weathered face that told the story of 2 decades spent in captivity. He was sitting in the recreation yard during exercise time, not moving, simply staring at the sky. He was not engaging in any of the ritualistic clockwise walking. He was simply sitting still, which I had not seen any other inmate do before. Over the following weeks, I observed Robert the Lifer whenever I could. He maintained the same pattern. During exercise time, he sat in the same location and stared at the sky. He did not interact with other inmates. He did not cause any trouble. He seemed to exist in a state of peaceful detachment from the world around him. One day I mentioned Robert the Lifer to Mike, asking if there was any particular reason he was allowed to deviate from the standard exercise yard behavior. Mike looked at me with an expression I could not quite read, and then he told me that Robert the Lifer had earned the right to sit in the yard rather than walk. This right had been granted to him approximately 15 years ago, after an incident that was never fully explained. The incident had resulted in a 2-week lockdown, but no inmates had been severely injured, and no details had ever been released about what had actually occurred. One of the most heavily enforced rules at Blackstone concerns communication between inmates and guards. Specifically, inmates are not permitted to initiate conversations with guards except in emergency situations. If an inmate needs to speak to a guard, they must wait until the guard approaches them. This rule is absolute and is enforced with severe consequences. The first time I witnessed a violation of this rule, I was shocked by the severity of the punishment. An inmate named James, the same one who had been taken to solitary for making eye contact, attempted to ask me a question about his work assignment. He had raised his hand politely and waited for me to acknowledge him. I had not yet, but he had taken my proximity as permission to speak. He asked me if he could be reassigned to work in the kitchen rather than in maintenance. Before I could even process the question, another guard appeared and escorted James away. Later, I learned that he had been sentenced to solitary confinement for a week for initiating communication with a guard. The sentence was not for the content of his request, which was entirely reasonable, but simply for the fact that he had spoken to me without permission. This rule seemed unnecessarily harsh and dehumanizing, yet it was enforced without exception. When I asked Mike about why this rule existed, he told me that it was a safety measure. If inmates could communicate freely with guards, they could potentially negotiate, manipulate, or attempt to exploit their positions. By restricting communication, the prison maintained a clear hierarchy and power dynamic. This explanation made sense on the surface, but it also seemed to serve another purpose. By preventing inmates from speaking to guards except in emergencies, the prison eliminated the possibility of inmates expressing grievances, requesting help, or advocating for themselves in any way. It was a perfect system for maintaining absolute control. 6 months into my employment, I was invited to observe one of the prison's regular meetings in what was called the observation room. This was a small chamber located above the cafeteria, visible through one-way glass. From this room, we could see the entire cafeteria without being seen ourselves. The purpose of the meetings was to monitor inmate behavior and identify any potential problems before they could develop. On this particular day, there were 4 guards present in the observation room, including myself and Mike. We stood silently watching the inmates eat their lunch. Everything seemed normal at first. The inmates were eating, moving through the cafeteria according to the established rules and patterns. But after about 20 minutes, I began to notice something unsettling. The inmates were all eating at exactly the same pace. They were all taking bites of their food at nearly identical intervals. They were all chewing with the same apparent frequency and speed. If one inmate would take a drink of water, several others would do the same within 10 to 15 seconds. It was as if they were all subtly synchronized without making any overt indication that they were aware of this synchronization. I looked over at Mike, who seemed completely unsurprised by this observation. I asked him if he noticed what was happening, and he looked at me calmly and said that this was normal. The inmates had learned to move with a kind of collective rhythm. It prevented conflicts, reduced waste, and maintained order. It was one of the emergent properties of prolonged incarceration in a highly structured environment. I could not accept this explanation because it was impossible. The inmates were not communicating with each other. They could not see each other clearly from where they were sitting. Yet they were maintaining this perfect synchronization as if they were parts of a single organism rather than individual people. During my 10th month at Blackstone, I requested and was granted assignment to the night shift for a 2-week trial period. This was my first mistake, though I did not know it at the time. Most guards preferred the day shift. The night shift was considered less desirable, which meant it offered opportunities for advancement to someone willing to volunteer for it. The night shift ran from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. for some areas, and 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. for the overnight areas. I was assigned to the overnight rotation, which meant I would be working from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The overnight shift had a skeleton crew of only 12 guards for the entire facility, compared to the nearly 40 guards who worked during the day. The first night was an education in itself. The facility that I knew during the day seemed to transform entirely after dark. The lighting was dimmer, which was logical for a time when most inmates were supposed to be sleeping. But the dimness gave the facility a dreamlike quality, as if the rules and structures of the daytime had become more flexible. I was partnered with a guard named Nick for that first night. Nick had been working overnight at Blackstone for almost 5 years, which was longer than anyone else currently assigned to the night shift. He seemed to understand the place in a way that day shift guards simply did not. He moved through the corridors with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what to expect. Nick told me that the overnight shift was fundamentally different from the day shift. Most inmates were in their cells, but not all of them. There was a cleaning crew that worked through the night, doing maintenance and sanitation of the facility. There was also a small group of inmates who worked in the kitchen preparing food for the next day. These inmates moved through the facility in a kind of twilight existence, neither fully engaged with the prison community nor fully isolated in their cells. Around 2:30 a.m., Nick and I were conducting a routine patrol of Block B when we heard what sounded like singing coming from one of the cells. It was not loud, but it was distinct and clearly intentional. Nick stopped walking and listened for a moment. Then he motioned for me to follow him. We approached the cell where the singing was coming from, and I could see through the small window that the inmate was standing at the far end of his cell, facing the wall, singing in a low voice. Nick did not stop the inmate or reprimand him. He simply observed for a moment and then continued walking. I asked him why he had not told the inmate to stop, and Nick replied that this particular inmate sang every night at this time. It was not disruptive, so it was permitted. I asked if this was an official exception to the rules, and Nick told me that there were many unwritten exceptions to the rules at Blackstone. The written rules were merely a framework. The actual operation of the prison depended on understanding the unwritten rules, and most of those unwritten rules were constantly evolving based on reasons that nobody could quite articulate. During my third night of the overnight shift, I was assigned to conduct a cell-to-cell inspection in Block D. This was a routine procedure that I had done many times during the day shift, but it felt different at night. The cells seemed larger somehow and the shadows seemed darker. I moved through the block methodically, checking that each cell was secure and that its occupant was present. When I reached cell 237, I noticed something I had not seen before. There was a message scratched into the metal frame of the bunk. The letters were small and carefully executed, clearly the work of someone who had spent considerable time creating them. The message read, "The light chooses, the darkness chooses us." I photographed the message with my phone and reported it to Nick. Nick examined the photograph and seemed entirely unsurprised. He told me that this cell had contained messages like this for at least 2 years. The maintenance crew was supposed to sand them off periodically, but they always reappeared within a few weeks. Nick suggested I report it to Mike and then forget about it. I did report it to Mike the next day during the day shift, and he responded exactly as Nick had predicted. Mike told me that some inmates used cell markings as a form of self-expression, and as long as the markings did not promote violence or contain information about escape plans, they were tolerated. He suggested I use pencil erasers to remove messages I found and not spend energy worrying about it, but I could not stop thinking about that message. The phrasing was deeply strange. It was not a name or a gang symbol or a personal affirmation. It was something philosophical, almost cryptic in nature. I found myself thinking about it constantly for several days, and I could not arrive at any logical interpretation of what it might mean. 3 weeks into my employment at Blackstone, I learned that the civilian maintenance worker Michael had not shown up for his scheduled shift. This was unprecedented because Michael had worked at the facility for 14 years and had never missed a day without advance notice. I asked Mike what had happened to him, and Mike told me that Michael had called in and resigned effective immediately. He had given no notice and provided no explanation. This seemed strange because Michael had appeared to be content with his job. He had a good relationship with both inmates and guards. He had no apparent reason to leave so suddenly. Yet when I asked around, nobody seemed particularly surprised or concerned. It was as if people expected this to happen eventually, though nobody would articulate why. A few weeks later, I ran into Michael at a grocery store about 30 miles from Blackstone. I approached him to say hello, and I immediately noticed that something about him had changed. He seemed distracted and anxious. He kept looking around as if he was worried about something. When I asked him why he had left his job so suddenly, he told me that he could not work at Blackstone anymore. He did not explain why, and he seemed unwilling to discuss it further. I pressed him, asking if there had been a specific incident that had caused him to leave, and he became visibly uncomfortable. He told me that I should leave Blackstone while I still could, while I still had a choice. He said that the longer I stayed there, the more of myself I would leave behind in that place. He would not explain what he meant, and then he simply walked away from me. That encounter disturbed me deeply because it suggested that Michael was not the first person to experience something at Blackstone that had caused them to abandon their job and their livelihood. It also suggested that people who worked at Blackstone underwent some kind of transformation that affected them even after they left. Solitary confinement at Blackstone is called the box. Being sent to the box results from violating any number of rules, from fighting to making eye contact during lunch, to initiating conversation with a guard to attempting to sit in the wrong cafeteria section. Once in the box, an inmate is held in a cell that is approximately 8 feet by 6 feet with a single toilet, a small sink, and a bunk. The cell is lit by a single fluorescent bulb that is never turned off. An inmate in the box can receive no visitors. They can receive their meals, but they cannot eat in the cafeteria. They are completely isolated from the prison population. The minimum sentence for being sent to the box is 3 days. The maximum has never been stated, but I have learned that some inmates have spent extended periods in the box, ranging from several months to over a year. These extended sentences are typically imposed for what would be considered serious infractions, such as attempting to escape or seriously injuring another inmate. One of the rules I have never been able to understand is that inmates in the box are permitted to read. They are given access to books from a small library that is specifically maintained for box inmates. However, there is a strict rule about which books are permitted. Inmates are not allowed to read anything that was published after 1995. This rule is strictly enforced, and library staff check the publication dates of every book given to a box inmate. When I asked Mike about the reasoning behind this rule, he told me that it was a measure to prevent inmates from accessing information about the outside world that might disturb them or make their confinement more psychologically difficult. However, this explanation made no sense because inmates could certainly imagine that the world had changed in the decades since 1995. Restricting them to older books seemed more likely to create confusion and false beliefs about the world, rather than to protect them from disturbing information. After Mike's unsatisfying explanation, I asked Nick about it during a night shift, and Nick gave me a different answer. He told me that there was a theory that books published after 1995 contained a specific type of information that could negatively affect the mental health of isolated inmates. He did not know what that information was specifically, and he could not explain why information from 1995 and earlier would be immune to this effect. He simply stated that this was the rule, and it had been in place long enough that nobody questioned it anymore. My first year at Blackstone was marked with a small ceremony in the employee break room. It was nothing elaborate, just a cake and some recognition of my tenure. Mike was there, and Tyler, and several other guards I had worked with regularly. Nobody mentioned anything specific about my first year, or gave me any particular advice about the future. It was simply an acknowledgement that I had been there for 12 months. After the ceremony, Tyler pulled me aside and asked me how I was feeling about my employment at Blackstone. I told him honestly that I was beginning to understand the strange rhythms and patterns that governed the place, but that I did not fully comprehend the underlying purpose or logic behind most of the rules. Tyler nodded as if this was exactly the answer he had expected. "That is good," Tyler said. "The moment you think you understand this place completely is the moment you have stopped seeing it clearly. As long as you remain confused and questioning, you maintain a connection to the outside world and to your own sense of reason. The ones who become dangerous are the ones who stop being confused, because that means they have begun to accept the logic of Blackstone as if it were normal." I asked Tyler if he had stopped being confused, and he did not answer me directly. He simply told me that after 12 years, confusion had transformed into something else entirely. He no longer questioned the rules because he understood that they were not rules in the conventional sense. They were more like the laws of physics. In this place, fundamental facts of reality that could not be questioned or challenged, only acknowledged and lived within. That conversation made me realize that I was slowly being transformed by this place in ways I could not fully articulate. My thinking was changing. My expectations about what was normal and acceptable were shifting. I was beginning to see the rules not as arbitrary impositions, but as the natural order of things within Blackstone's walls. As my second year at Blackstone began, I found myself becoming increasingly fascinated with Robert the Lifer, the inmate who shared my name. I had learned more details about him over the intervening months. He had been convicted of a crime that would now be considered a misdemeanor. He had received a life sentence due to a particularly harsh judge and circumstances that had led to an extremely unfavorable trial outcome. Over his 19 years at Blackstone, he had become something of a fixture, accepted and integrated into the institution in a way that was unique. One day, I requested and was granted permission to meet with Robert the Lifer in a private interview room. This was unusual because guards typically had no reason to conduct private interviews with inmates, but I had framed my request as a routine psychological evaluation, and it was approved without much question. When Robert the Lifer entered the interview room, I was struck by how calm and centered he appeared. He did not seem nervous or concerned about the meeting. He simply sat down across from me and waited for me to speak. I told him that we shared the same name, and that I was curious about his experiences in the prison over his nearly 2 decades of incarceration. Robert the Lifer looked at me for a long moment before responding. When he did speak, his voice was quiet and measured. He told me that he had been at Blackstone so long that he had largely stopped thinking of the outside world as his home. He had become one with the institution in a way that he could not fully explain to someone who had not experienced it. He said that the rules and rhythms of Blackstone had become more real to him than his own memories of the life he had lived before his incarceration. I asked him if he was happy, and he smiled a small smile. He told me that happiness was a concept that had become somewhat irrelevant to him. He existed now in a state of acceptance that transcended happiness or unhappiness. He had made peace with his situation not through resignation, but through a kind of spiritual evolution that the prison itself seemed to facilitate. Before the interview ended, Robert the Lifer asked me a question. He asked me if I believed that places could be alive, that institutions could possess a kind of consciousness or will of their own. I did not know how to answer that question, and my hesitation seemed to satisfy him. He told me that I would understand what he meant eventually, if I stayed long enough. By the beginning of my 2nd year, I had become acutely aware of the temperature fluctuations in different sections of the facility. What had initially seemed random now appeared to follow a pattern that was both subtle and deeply intentional. The temperature in Block A was consistently kept at approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Block B was maintained at around 72 degrees. Block C fluctuated between 75 and 80 degrees. Block D, where the most violent and unpredictable inmates were housed, was kept at a steady 82 degrees. I mentioned this observation to Michael, the maintenance worker, during one of his visits to the day shift break room before his sudden resignation. Michael had seemed troubled by my observation, as if I had noticed something I was not supposed to notice. He told me that the temperature variations were not accidental. They were part of a system that had been implemented approximately 15 years ago by the prison's administration. The purpose was to maintain emotional regulation among the inmate population through environmental manipulation. Michael explained that higher temperatures tended to make people more aggressive and energetic, while lower temperatures seemed to promote calm and introspection. By strategically adjusting temperatures in different blocks, the prison could influence the overall behavioral patterns of inmates without using chemical means or explicit behavioral modification programs. It was a subtle form of control that most people would never even consciously recognize was happening. This revelation troubled me because it suggested that the prison was conducting experiments on its inmate population without their knowledge or consent. When I asked Michael if this was authorized by the prison administration, he told me that technically it was, because the administration had approved the installation of the temperature control systems. However, no inmate was aware that the temperature was being deliberately manipulated to influence their behavior. It was a form of psychological conditioning conducted without informed consent. During my 14th month at Blackstone, I discovered another strange rule that was not written anywhere in the official handbook. Certain numbers appeared to be considered unlucky or taboo. The number 7 never appeared on work schedules. The number 19 was never used to designate cell blocks or sections. The number 13 was treated as if it did not exist within the facility. I first noticed this when I was reviewing work schedules and realized that they jumped from shift 6 directly to shift 8, skipping 7. When I asked about this, I was told that it was simply how the system had always been. The reason had been lost to time. It was simply accepted that there was no shift 7. The cell block designation was even stranger. The blocks were designated A through K, 13 blocks in total. However, they appeared to be labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and K, which should have only been 11 blocks. When I counted the physical blocks in the facility, there were definitely 13. This meant that one of the letters appeared twice, or that one block had a different designation that I was not seeing. After considerable investigation, I discovered that Block M was the missing block. It existed physically but was never officially designated as Block M. Instead, it was listed in all official documents as Block K, which created a duplicate designation. The physical building that was Block M was officially non-existent in all records and paperwork. When I asked Tyler about this discrepancy, He told me that Block M was rarely used for regular inmate housing. It was reserved for special purposes that were not discussed openly. He suggested that I not concern myself with Block M, and that I should not attempt to access that area without explicit authorization from the warden's office. This sparked my curiosity even more, but I learned from Tyler's tone that asking further questions would be unwise. The existence of Block M, its non-existence in official records, and its mysterious purpose all pointed to something that was being deliberately hidden or kept separate from the regular operations of the prison. 16 months into my employment, I witnessed an incident that shook my understanding of the prison's control mechanisms. It occurred during lunch hour, right at 12 p.m. when the eye contact rule was in effect. An inmate who was new to the facility, a man named James, sat down at his table and immediately looked up at the wrong time. He made direct eye contact with an inmate across the room. Usually, when this rule was broken, the violator was quickly removed. But on this day, something different happened. The moment James made eye contact with the other inmate, every single other inmate in the cafeteria stopped what they were doing. All of them stopped eating simultaneously. All of them turned their heads in the direction of James's gaze, and then, moving in perfect synchronization, they all returned their attention to their food. It happened in the span of maybe 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds I saw something that suggested the inmate population was operating under a level of coordination that went far beyond what I had previously understood. It was not that they were aware of the rule violation and reacting to it. It was as if they were all connected to some kind of collective consciousness that responded to stimuli in unison. James was immediately removed from the cafeteria and sent to the box for the standard 5-day sentence. But what I had witnessed stayed with me. It suggested that the inmates had developed or been trained to develop a level of coordinated response that was almost militaristic in nature. They moved and reacted not as individuals but as a collective organism. I mentioned this observation to Mike, and his response was surprisingly direct. He told me that over time, inmates in a highly controlled environment like Blackstone developed what he called a herd consciousness. They learned to read each other's body language and the subtle signals that passed between them. They developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate problems and respond to them collectively before authority figures even knew a problem existed. He told me that this was actually a positive development from the prison's perspective, because it meant that the inmates themselves maintained order and discipline, reducing the workload on the guards. Mike's explanation was plausible from a sociological perspective, but it did not fully account for the precision and synchronization I had witnessed. There seemed to be something more fundamental at work than simple herd behavior or collective learning. My second year at Blackstone was marked by the same modest ceremony as my first year. There was cake, there was recognition, and then people returned to their work. But this time something felt different. I was no longer the new guard. There were newer guards now, and I was being asked to help train them. I was being integrated more fully into the staff hierarchy. I was becoming part of the institution in a way that I was only beginning to understand. During the second anniversary ceremony, the warden made a brief appearance. The warden was a man named James Holbrook, who kept himself almost entirely separate from the regular guards and inmates. He was rarely seen in the facility itself. He operated from a closed office that was accessible only to high-ranking administrators. His appearance at our anniversary ceremony was therefore noteworthy. The warden did not speak for long. He simply acknowledged my 2 years of service and expressed hope that I would continue my employment at Blackstone for many years to come. But there was something in the way he said this that felt like more than a simple expression of hope. It felt like a statement of fact, as if he knew something about my future that I did not know about myself. After the warden left, Tyler pulled me aside and asked me if I had understood what the warden had meant. I told him that I was not sure, and Tyler told me that what the warden had expressed was not a hope but an expectation. He had been confirming that I would be staying at Blackstone. The decision had apparently already been made by someone other than myself. I asked Tyler when this decision had been made, and he told me that it had probably been made during my interview process for the job, before I had even started working here. The prison apparently had a way of identifying which potential employees would be suitable for long-term employment and which would need to move on. Something about me had indicated to the administration that I was someone who could be retained long-term. One day during my third week of the overnight shift, I was assigned to monitor the visitation room. This was unusual because normally, visitation occurred during day hours only between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. on Saturdays and Sundays. Night shift guards rarely had anything to do with the visitation room. But on this particular evening, I was informed that there would be a special visitation at 9 p.m. for one specific inmate. The inmate was Robert the Lifer. His visitor was a woman in her early 30s who introduced herself as his daughter. I was instructed to monitor the visitation, but to not interfere unless there was a rule violation. The visitation took place behind a thick piece of plexiglass with a telephone communication system, which was standard procedure for security reasons. I observed the interaction between Robert the Lifer and his daughter. They spoke for approximately 30 minutes. The daughter appeared to be crying, though I could not hear the conversation. Robert the Lifer remained calm and composed throughout. At the end of the 30 minutes, the visitation ended, and the daughter was escorted out of the facility. After the daughter left, I asked a colleague why Robert the Lifer had been granted a special evening visitation when the normal visitation hours were on weekends during day shifts. My colleague told me that Robert the Lifer received special privileges because of his long tenure at the facility and his exemplary behavior. He was allowed to have one special visitation every 6 months outside of normal visiting hours. However, when I checked the visitation records, I found something interesting. The last special visitation for Robert the Lifer had been approximately 3 years ago. This meant that a special visitation should not have been due for another 3 years based on the 6-month cycle. Yet it had been approved and conducted anyway. When I asked Mike about this discrepancy, he seemed uncomfortable and told me not to concern myself with special exceptions to the rules. By my 3rd year at Blackstone, I had come to understand that the prison operated on a philosophy that was fundamentally different from most other correctional institutions. The official mission statement, printed in every employee handbook, spoke of rehabilitation, security, and order. However, the actual day-to-day operations of the facility suggested a different underlying purpose. Tyler and I discussed this one evening during a night shift. We were in the break room having coffee when Tyler told me something that he said he had never told another person. He said that Blackstone was not actually a prison in the conventional sense. It was an experiment. The inmates, the guards, the staff, and the structure itself were all part of an ongoing study into human behavior, control, and the possibility of creating a perfectly ordered society. I asked Tyler who was conducting this experiment, and he told me that he did not know. It was certainly done with the knowledge and approval of the federal government, because the prison received official funding and oversight. But whether the experiment was being conducted by a specific agency or by a collection of researchers from various institutions, he could not say. What he did know was that the prison had been operating on these principles for at least 20 years, and there was no indication that it would ever change. Tyler explained that the purpose of the experiment was to identify systems of control that would maintain perfect order and security while minimizing violence and incidents. The goal was to create a prison where disturbances were so rare that they were almost non-existent. From a statistical perspective, Blackstone was extraordinarily successful. The number of serious incidents per capita was significantly lower than in any other maximum security prison in the United States. The way they had achieved this, according to Tyler, was through a combination of environmental control, behavioral conditioning, and what he called sympathetic coercion. They did not break people through brutality. Instead, they worked with the natural rhythms of the human mind and body to create an environment where order and compliance became the natural state of being. During my 3rd year, I finally discovered the reason behind the clockwise walking in the recreation yard. I had been reviewing some older files in the administrative office, looking for something else entirely, when I came across a document that had been filed away but not discarded. The document was dated 19 years ago and contained notes about an experiment conducted in the recreation yard. According to the notes, it had been discovered that when inmates walked in a consistent circular pattern in the same direction, their heart rates synchronized. When all inmates in a space were walking in the same direction and maintaining the same pace, their individual heart rates began to correlate with one another. This created a kind of physiological harmony among the group. The researchers theorized that this synchronization promoted feelings of unity and connection, which reduced aggressive behavior and maintained peace among the inmate population. Once this phenomenon had been discovered, the administration had subtly encouraged inmates to walk clockwise in the recreation yard. No explicit rule was created. Instead, the first few inmates to go to the yard each day were already walking clockwise when the others arrived, and the others simply followed the established pattern. Within a few weeks, all inmates had naturally adopted the clockwise walking behavior, and it had persisted for nearly 2 decades. The fact that this was not an explicit rule, but rather an emergent behavior that had been carefully engineered by the administration, revealed the sophisticated nature of the control mechanisms in place at Blackstone. They did not need to command compliance. They had learned how to create conditions under which compliance and order emerged naturally from the environment itself. 18 months into my 3rd year at Blackstone,
I made a discovery that changed everything.
I was working the night shift and I had gone to Block M, which was technically off limits but was rarely monitored during night hours. I had been curious about it for so long that I finally decided to violate this rule and see what was actually in that mysterious block. What I found was shocking in its ordinariness. Block M contained cells just like any other cell block, but these cells were different in a crucial way. They were completely soundproof. Double walls, acoustic insulation, sealed doors. Every element of the design was dedicated to ensuring that no sound could travel into or out of these cells. When I looked at the records for Block M, I found that there were 16 cells in this block. According to official records, Block M did not exist, which meant that the 16 inmates housed in these cells did not officially exist either. They were not listed in any prisoner manifest. They received no official food allocations. They did not exist in the system at all. I spent the rest of that night attempting to gather more information about these phantom inmates. I looked through visitor logs, but there were no visits to Block M. I looked through work assignments, but no inmates from Block M were listed. It was as if these 16 people had been completely erased from the official records of the facility, while still being physically present within the prison. When I reported my findings to Mike the next day, his face went pale. He told me in no uncertain terms that I had accessed an area I should not have accessed and that I should forget everything I had seen. He told me that there were aspects of Blackstone's operations that were classified, and that my security clearance did not include access to information about Block M. He ordered me never to mention Block M to anyone and never to access that area again. The tone in Mike's voice made it clear that this was not a suggestion, but a direct order from someone who was extremely concerned about what I had discovered. After that conversation, I understood that there were secrets at Blackstone that went far deeper than I had suspected. After my discovery about Block M, I found myself in a peculiar position. I knew something that I was supposed to forget, and I was unable to discuss it with anyone because acknowledging that I knew about it would reveal that I had violated direct orders. The knowledge became a burden that I could not share or process with another person. Over the following weeks, I became increasingly isolated within the facility. I was no longer invited to informal gatherings with other guards. People seemed to regard me differently, as if they knew something had changed but were not sure what. Tyler, who had been my closest friend among the staff, began to distance himself from me. When I attempted to speak with him, he would find excuses to leave. I realized that my discovery had marked me somehow, whether through surveillance cameras that I had not known about, through some kind of report system, or simply through the perceptiveness of the other staff members. Everyone seemed to know that I had ventured into forbidden territory. The silent reaction I received was more effective at suppressing my curiosity than any overt punishment could have been. The isolation I experienced during those weeks was profound. I found myself questioning whether I had actually discovered Block M, or whether I had somehow imagined it. This is how power works at Blackstone, I realized. It does not always work through explicit control. Sometimes it works through the manipulation of information and the creation of doubt in your own perception of reality. One evening, about 2 weeks after my discovery of Block M, Nick found me in the break room during the night shift. He seemed to have something he wanted to tell me, and he carefully checked to ensure we were alone before speaking. He told me that he knew what I had done, and he knew that I was troubled by the knowledge I had gained. Nick said that he had made similar discoveries during his early years at Blackstone. He had accessed areas he should not have accessed. He had learned things he was not supposed to know, and he had gone through the same period of isolation and self-doubt that I was currently experiencing. He told me that the best thing I could do was to let it go, to accept that there were aspects of Blackstone that I would never fully understand, and that my job was simply to perform my duties and not ask questions about the bigger picture. I asked Nick if he had ever reported what he knew about Block M to anyone outside the facility, and he told me that he had considered it many times. But he had come to understand that reporting it would accomplish nothing. The classified operations conducted at Blackstone were presumably authorized at the highest levels of government. To report them would be to waste energy on something that was far above his pay grade and his ability to influence. Nick told me something else that stayed with me. He said that the real purpose of Blackstone was not punishment or rehabilitation. It was research. The entire facility was a laboratory where human behavior and control mechanisms were being studied on a massive scale. The inmates were test subjects who had no idea they were being tested. The guards were both monitors and part of the test themselves. And the few of us who had discovered this reality were faced with a choice. We could accept it and continue working here, or we could try to resist it and likely face severe consequences. By the end of my third year at Blackstone, I had reached a kind of acceptance regarding the nature of the place. I understood now that this was not a normal prison. I understood that strange rules existed for reasons that were scientifically grounded, but kept hidden from the general population. I understood that there were inmates in Block M whose very existence was not acknowledged by the official prison system. And I understood something else that Tyler had tried to tell me months ago. I had stopped being confused about Blackstone. I had accepted its logic as reality. The transformation that Michael the maintenance worker had warned me about was complete. I could no longer imagine working anywhere else or living in a world outside these walls. Blackstone had become my reality, and the outside world had become the dream. My family had noticed the change in me during my periodic visits home. My mother asked if something was wrong. My father seemed concerned about my mental state. My brother had stopped calling. The life I had lived before Blackstone now seemed like it belonged to someone else, someone I used to be but could no longer comprehend. I realized that this was the true purpose of the facility. It was not primarily about studying the inmates. It was about studying the transformation of people who worked within such an environment, who were exposed to such extreme control mechanisms over an extended period. Guards who had been here long enough, like Tyler and Mike and Nick, had all undergone this same transformation. We had all become integrated into the system to such a degree that we could no longer imagine being separate from it. On my last day of my third year, I stood in the recreation yard during my assigned break. It was 11:30 a.m. on a clear day. The inmates were engaged in their various activities. Some were walking clockwise around the perimeter. Some were playing basketball. Some were simply sitting in the sun. All of them were existing within the carefully controlled parameters that governed their lives. I realized that I had arrived at the point that all long-term employees at Blackstone reached. I was no longer thinking of myself as separate from this place. I was no longer an observer. I was part of the system itself. My decisions, my actions, my very thoughts were now aligned with the principles that governed Blackstone. I had become one with the institution. The warden had said that he expected me to continue my employment here for many years to come, and I now understood that this was not just an expectation, but a certainty. There was nothing outside these walls that could offer me what this place had given me. There was no career path, no opportunity, no life experience that would make sense after having existed within Blackstone. I was, in essence, as trapped here as any of the inmates, though my cage was more comfortable and I was on the other side of the bars. The strange rules that had initially seemed incomprehensible now made perfect sense to me. The temperature fluctuations, the eye contact prohibitions, the clockwise walking, the clock format for all times, the rules about blue fabric in the East Wing, the separated cafeteria sections, the restrictions on inmate communication with guards, the hidden Block M with its phantom inmates. All of it constituted a system that was designed with precision to maintain a specific psychological and social order. And I was now part of the system. I was invested in it. I was complicit in it, and I could no longer imagine a future where I was not. As I stood in the recreation yard, watching the inmates move through their routines, I experienced a moment of clarity followed immediately by profound disorientation. I understood that I had just accepted my own imprisonment, even though my cell had wider walls and better lighting than those of the inmates I supervised. This is what Blackstone does to people. This is what it is designed to do. Not to imprison people in cells, though that is what it does to the inmates, but to imprison people within systems of control so complete and so subtle that they eventually stop fighting against them. The inmates walk clockwise because they have been engineered to do so. The guards accept rules and operations that make no logical sense because we have been engineered to do so as well. I am now part of the prison's consciousness, and the prison is part of mine. I report for my shifts. I enforce the rules. I monitor the inmates, and I do these things without question because questioning them has become impossible. The questions have been systematically removed from my capacity to ask them. This is my 3rd year at Blackstone. This is my understanding. This is my reality. And I suspect that I will be here for many more years, continuing to perform my duties, continuing to participate in an experiment whose full scope and purpose I will never completely understand. The strange rules will continue to govern my existence. The mysterious mechanisms of control will continue to operate, and the institution will continue to transform people who enter it until they become indistinguishable from the system itself. I am Robert. I am 34 years old. I work at Blackstone Correctional Facility in the hidden corners of Nevada, and I have come to understand that the most dangerous prison is not one built of concrete and steel. It is one built of refined control mechanisms, subtle conditioning, and systems so efficient that you do not realize you are imprisoned until it is far too late to escape. The sun is setting over the recreation yard. The inmates are being called back to their cells. I am preparing for the end of my shift. Tomorrow at 6 a.m. I will return here, and the day after that, and the day after that. The strange rules will continue. The machines will continue to hum, and I will continue to be part of Blackstone, as it has become part of me. This is the story of my employment at a maximum security prison where the rules make no sense until you understand that they are not designed to make sense. They are designed to work, and they do work. They work perfectly.